them to the same rules as everyone else. So you've been doing this for 19 years. You've watched this. Maybe give some perspective on what has occurred over 19 years, why it didn't, let's say, pass the first time, why it continues to either be met with derision by some in the oil community, or the threats that it faces. Just really, and do you think it can happen now? Well, we did read that, as I said before, President Trump said in 2011 that this should happen. So, thanks.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I would be a little less negative about NOPEC than your question suggested. It actually has been, the legislative process in Congress is difficult, but it has been quite a successful piece of legislation whenever it's been considered. From 2000 to 2012, during the time that I was there and Senator Cole was there, the Senate Judiciary Committee passed the Judiciary Committee without a dissenting vote 6 or 7 times, and each Congress that it was considered. And then, and it also passed the House Judiciary Committee without a dissenting vote on several occasions during that period. In 2007, it passed both houses of Congress, the full houses of Congress on the floor. It got 70 votes in the Senate and 345 in the House, which are both veto-proof majorities. And now it was in 2 different vehicles. In the Senate, it was an amendment to an energy bill that never was enacted. In the House, it was standalone legislation. And because it was 2 different vehicles, it wasn't presented to the president. But that shows a great deal of support whenever it's been seriously considered. Just recently, it passed the House Judiciary Committee without a dissenting vote in its current incarnation. So, why has it not been enacted into law? I guess was presented in 2007 when this happened. I thought it was on the 5-yard line. To use a football analogy, just needs a little bit more. That's right. So that's sort of the high, right, on the 5-yard line, but not in the end zone. That's sort of the high water mark. So what happened? Well, at that time, we faced the veto threat from the administration. They said they would veto it, the George W. Bush administration. Why did they do that? Well, it met with objections from the State Department that it's going to mess up our foreign relations, particularly with Saudi Arabia. Of course, we've done such great foreign relations with Saudi Arabia since then, and there's been a number of tragedies that have occurred since then. But so I don't think that's very strong. And also, obviously the oil companies opposed it, and they found probably found receptive voice in some elements of the Bush administration at the time. So I think that's the reason it didn't succeed is it knew it faced veto threat. Now, as I say, it had veto-proof majorities. And it also, the legislative process is very difficult. And, especially when you're dealing with a sort of discrete bill like this. To get a discrete bill like this through the Senate, generally they're not given floor time unless they're part of bigger packages, as it was part of the energy bill. But then the overall energy bill didn't pass because there were controversial provisions. It didn't pass the House because there were controversial provisions in that. So it's difficult, but I think it's, can I just expand on the question? I mean, I think it's an idea whose time has come once again. And, one often hears, what's it going to do? Well, first of all, the threat of OPEC is growing. It's not something that's just an artifact of 20 years ago. We now have Russia and 10 countries that have participated in oil supply cutbacks, starting with November of 2017. And so, if you allow an international cartel, any cartel, to survive unscathed, it's just going to grow. People say, we can't beat it, why don't we join it? And the other thing is, I saw an interesting article on the CNBC website a couple months ago, and there was talk that Russia and those 10 countries would formally join OPEC. And the idea was rejected, and according to this article, the Russian energy minister said there is a consensus that there will be no such organization that is a broader OPEC, including Russia and the 10 countries. That's because it requires additional bureaucratic brouhaha. NOPEC said, that's Alexander NOPEC, the Russian oil energy minister, noting bipartisan U.S. legislation aimed at breaking up OPEC. Well, that's NOPEC. And I think people are aware of that. And I think NOPEC has a lot of power. And, and again, this goes beyond the question you asked me. Well, how would NOPEC work? I don't think you would need to file a lawsuit under NOPEC. The mere threat of that, I think, would deter many countries from taking anti-competitive actions or taking action to raise the price of oil. And I think we've just seen that with this. They're not going to do a formal organization of Russia and 10 countries plus OPEC. So I'm sorry I was so long-winded, but I think it has some It does have some major opponents in the oil companies and in the nations that are part of OPEC, but I think it has a lot of support too. So I wouldn't be unduly pessimistic about it. And as you pointed out, President Trump, one of you two, go ahead, which one of you? President Trump in a book a few years ago supported the idea. So we now have, a president that supports this idea, in addition to the past of having vast majorities in Congress. So I'm not pessimistic about it. I think that the prospects for the NOPEC legislation are bright. But like anything in Congress, nothing's easy. So it'll take a little bit of some work to do.
Professor, first, you say in your memo that it's a relatively modest approach. So use that word modest, or I think it's moderate approach, sorry, not modest. And, as we talked about before, the sky is falling. Okay, so I guess give us a sense of why you think that's, why that is.
So we can vote on whether we like modest or moderate. I had modest, Robbie, the edits like moderate. But either way, what is interesting and in some sense key to the bill is that the bill does not make the oil cartel, and I want to just go really beyond OPEC, because the bill applies not just to the members of OPEC, but to any oil company and any state-owned entity, oil company, that conspires to set prices. So it's not just about the OPEC members. I think it's an important point. So whether Russia joins OPEC and makes it ROPEC, I think they're going to change it to that, or they just simply conspire with the OPEC countries, does not make a difference from the point of view of this bill. Second thing is a lot of the sky is falling discussion about subjecting the oil cartel to antitrust law assumes that what we're talking about is private litigation with big damages. That was the setting of the prior litigation. There were 4 cases. The concern is, oh my God, they've actually caused a lot of damage to people in the United States. They might actually sue us for it and try to collect, and that would be awful. Well, whether you think that's awful or not, this bill does not do that. This bill is very targeted, and the only enforcer, this is unlike the rest of the antitrust laws actually, the only enforcer is the United States Department of Justice, and so it will be up to the executive branch using its tools to carry out the mandate of OPEC. And they'll have discretion whether to enforce it and how. And the chances of the United States enforcing it through treble damages actions, I will tell you for technical reasons, is really remote. I wouldn't make bets on it in Las Vegas. Very remote. There are other tools that it has. Civil cases for injunctions, or I have to say, even criminal cases, which may incentivize actually the breakup of this cartel, even without bringing the case. But so in that sense, modest or moderate, it's not the full panoply of antitrust, but putting the decision whether to bring any case and what sort of case to bring and who to sue completely in the hands of the United States Department of Justice, the executive branch.
I think also NOPEC is important because it will help get in people's mind the right appreciation of the position that the United States is in with regard to oil. I think Mayor Ballard expressed it very eloquently, but if you talk to a wide spectrum of even quite well-informed public officials, knowledgeable citizens, this understanding of the way oil works in our economy is simply not widely known. I would say the average, even well-informed citizen and many times leader said, well, the United States is producing 11 million barrels a year, end of problem. They don't realize that oil is an international market. They don't realize that the cheapest producer is Saudi Arabia, as we have now learned officially from the Aramco documents which have been filed with, isn't that ironic? Exclusion from antitrust legislation, but can go into our capital markets and raise money to take back to Saudi Arabia to use to support Saudi Arabian interests even more. I mean, come on, fool me once, fool me twice. But So I think that NOPEC is important in that it's based on this appreciation of how the oil market really works, how American national interests really align with those of Saudi Arabia, and attempts to draw that distinction and work that difference. So I think it's more than just the NOPEC itself. I think it's fitting into a picture of how the United States government should think about oil and should act to protect its interests.
So keep the mic for a sec. So this idea that citizens can't sue and it's really a unitary executive branch decision, because the State Department has always said, you know, you shouldn't do this because it would, you know, create havoc and every American would sue. Like, does that give you, would you support the other way, or does it, because of the way it's written, give you even more reason to say we should do this? And you've been in the executive branch. What do you think will happen, and how will make that decision?
I think that any decision to use, I mean, what will happen is a meeting of the National Security advising apparatus, either the NSC or some part of it will get together, and there will be a problem. Price of oil is going too high. Saudi Arabia has taken an action against our interests, so on, and each department will make its input, and then a strategy will be worked out, a combination of diplomacy, military deployments, NOPEC action, and it'll be part of a coherent strategy to support our interests. And I would frankly give this administration high marks for using some of the sticks, economic sticks that the United States has against countries like China, who are you know, ripping huge numbers of dollars out of American companies' pockets by other techniques, and going against them with strong counteractions rather than simply talking points in meetings that we have with these other countries. We have to have penalties generally in our pocket. Sometimes you deploy them in order to protect our interests when we are dealing with a country that can pitch this country into recession, that can pull $300 billion out of the pockets of consumers and companies, and we need some tools to give our government to work. So I think that this tool properly belongs in the executive branch. I don't know a lot about whether citizens' suits would be counterproductive or productive, but they're a little harder to control than a coherent government strategy. And so I think this is a good place to start, and it will be used responsibly by this administration and by future administrations.
Just a couple more questions, and we'll turn it over to the crowd. And I'm going to go to Andy. Andy. Look, it's not, I don't know, maybe it's because it's so obvious that it's a cartel, but there are not a lot of economists who like to talk about it. Oil analysts like to say this is a terrible idea. But, you know, and I know you're not sitting around every day going, like, I don't understand why my whole cohort of economists don't see the world as it is. But maybe give us a sense of, like, why there is this exception, or why people, you know, don't sort of stand up and say, you know, what it is and what we should do about it.
Why the economics profession has failed to tackle.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, it's always so surprising to me how, like, it's so obvious. Maybe if people can't believe it because it's right in your, staring in your face.
Yeah. So not to brag too much on my profession, but you know, economists actually aren't that interested in the real world. Most of them are mostly interested in math, and so there's not a lot of attention to institutional details in modern economic theory, and so we tend not to look at these things. So the existence of a cartel is kind of a 1-0 variable. You throw in a regression and you're done. So what I think economists would agree on is cartels are hard to maintain. There's an incentive to cheat. So if I can get everybody here to agree and then I can go cheat, I'll clean up. And the more pressure you can put on a cartel, the more opportunities to pick members off, the more things like that, and this is exactly what this bill would do, the more likely the cartel is to crack. And so I think, you know, if we got 100 economists in a room and forced them to have only one opinion, they would say cartels are bad and cartels are vulnerable to pressure. They're not spending as much time with the real world as they should. I apologize on behalf of my profession.
It's okay. I just stare at people all the time when they tell me, you know, sort of the opposite, and then you're like, it just makes no sense to you, and you think like you must be living on Mars. I mean, I found the only 5 people who talk about this. I'm just joking around. So, Harry, is there precedent in the U.S. Bringing antitrust action against foreign states and their agents? So give us a sense of that in the history.
So the antitrust cases involving foreign sovereign units have generally been brought against state-owned enterprises, not against the states, the countries themselves. And there are some cases like that in the airline industry, for example, both criminal and civil, and in various industries. You can find cases. But the targets have generally been state-owned enterprises because they're the ones who are usually carrying out the commercial policies and are also doing business in the United States so that you can get service and process over them. So that said, there has been a recent uptick in actually criminal prosecutions of state-owned enterprises, not so much in the antitrust area, but outside that, particularly in intellectual property and trade secrets. So this is not an unfamiliar thing in the legal terrain, and the Justice Department has said that this is its consistent policy.
And if I can just add to that area, and I think this might also complement the question, there have been a large number of cases against private companies, international private antitrust conspiracies. And I don't know if anybody remembers the movie The Informant in 2009 with that team. And it was about the international licensing conspiracy, which was primarily Japanese private actors. But there's been a whole number of them. You mentioned even, vitamins and a lot of other ones. And so there's nothing. It's totally accepted in U.S. antitrust law that the government can go after criminally private actors, international actors who are engaged in price-fixing conspiracies as long as it affects the United States. And so the only thing unique about OPEC is that this conduct is engaged by nations or state-owned enterprises. And but why, from a logical point of view, why should it be any different? Again, they're engaged in commercial activity selling oil to profit. There should be no reason that these nation states or their state-owned companies should be shielded, and that's from antitrust liability, and that's the point of
So just, we talk a lot about price, but let's not forget that monopolies have other bad consequences. There's a saying that the best of all monopoly profits is a quiet life. And they tend to stifle innovation. They tend to stifle change. And so if you want to have a monopoly, one of the points of monopolies, as somebody mentioned earlier, is they don't want to disrupt the market for energy. They don't want to see disruption in that. So stopping monopoly actors in energy markets is not just about price. It's about encouraging innovation and change and disruption, which is in our interest to see.
So actually, Mayor Ballard, it's a perfect segue for you because you talk about some of this innovation in transportation that we should be embracing. And why don't you talk a little bit about how you see the solutions?
That's a great point. I do want to reiterate just one thing that Admiral Blair said one time, that if we can get the country to understand the oil market as a result of this legislation, wonderful, that'd be a wonderful thing. But there is new technology coming in transportation. And a lot of you know about it, some of you don't, but I would suggest, when I talk, and I talk frequently about this, but I try to concentrate in the South and the Midwest because the knowledge of what's happening, not just in this market, but also the innovations that are coming are not well known. And I'm trying to make sure that they are well known. You can go to California and you can go to New York and people kind of know what's going on something because they're different states, they have different policies within their states, and they're kind of on it. But the new technology that's coming in innovation, the new technology that's coming in transportation is pretty dramatic. The market is not there yet. If you tried to go buy an electric SUV today, you got kind of one choice as of today, which is the very expensive Tesla Model X, right? But Tesla now has a Model 3 that's coming out, and don't tell my wife, but I may order one on Friday, so we'll see. But
I hope she's not watching.
I hope she's not watching. But yeah, but you literally can't move in that direction, generally speaking, because the manufacturers aren't there yet, and there's a host of reasons for all of this. But if that moves, the trucks move. Tesla has a semi coming out. Mercedes has lots of trucks on lots of levels coming out, and they're already out there. Penske Leasing has bought a lot of trucks from Mercedes on all their different brand names. A lot of this is changing right now. There's probably seen that there's been solar planes, there's been electric planes, boats have been testing electricity. I mean, some of this is very early stage, but the car and the truck stuff is not really early stage. It's a matter of getting them to the market and getting acceptance into the market. And we can change that really dramatically pretty fast. I think within 10 or 12 years, I think we can really make some progress on that. Again, since 70% of the world's oil is used for transportation, that's where you go. And it's pretty obvious. And I don't care if it's electric, to be honest with you. I'm ambivalent, but it's kind of staring us in the face. Hydrogen fuel cells out there, but as I tell people all the time, I can't find a hydrogen fuel cell filling station. But all I do at night with my Prius Prime right now, which I have right now, I just plug it into that wall socket. And when I tell that to people, they look at me aghast. What? Yeah, I plug it in like you plug in a lamp. They literally don't know this. And I think that as if we could change that sort of thing, change that knowledge, but then we have to, it's a little upsetting to me on lots of levels, but I can't blame the manufacturers. I'm a capitalist. I want manufacturers to make a profit. Dealerships make half their gross revenue on maintenance. Maintenance on these cars is check the tires, check the brakes, and make sure there's windshield washer fluid in there. It's about it. Those issues have to be dealt with. But if you look at the bigger picture and what that will do for our troops, how much money we have to spend to protect the oil infrastructure around the world, what we're all talking about right now, the unfair oil market, you have to weigh those things. And I think the answer comes out pretty clearly. And like I say, it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it can happen. I think within the next 20 years we actually could do this. But we have to get more acceptance, we have to get a little bit more innovation that's going on. But I think it's around the corner. I don't think this, when I actually majored in economics, I hate to tell you that. But when I used to teach economics a little bit, when I would research this subject, I could go back into the 60s and 70s, and I saw congressional testimony. In 20 years, we're going to have battery cars and electric cars. In the 70s, in 20 years, we're going to have it. In the 80s, in 20 years, we're going to have it. Well, you know what? We have it. We have it. It's getting better. It's getting a lot cheaper. Energy is getting a lot denser. And I wish the federal government, state governments, municipal governments would embrace it. There's 500,000 cars in the federal fleet. They all can't be electric today, but pretty close to all of them could be plug-in hybrids. And they can put 80 to 90% of their miles on electricity. Makes up a lot of difference. It's a lot of difference.
Could I add one more aspect to this? Because if you were to ask me which country in the world is most advanced on getting off of oil for the transportation sector, which big country, I would answer China right now. And China is doing it for the same reasons that we're sitting here talking about it. China is much more dependent on completely imported oil than is the United States. As we've discussed before, the oil lifeline is maintained and could be cut at any time by its arch rival in the world, the United States. And so China is working very, very hard on trying to diversify its, and also China has the environmental factor in a much more immediate way. If any of you has spent some time when the wind is not blowing in Beijing or Shanghai would know. So China is deeply committed to this. More electric vehicles are sold in China than are sold in any other country. China is using all of the ways that it has to get the best intellectual property in the world from other companies and applying it in China, protecting its own market. And it could well be that if the United States does not follow this for its own purposes with the vigor that it can, that China will end up being the country that dominates the electrical transportation or the non-oil transportation of the future, and with all the implications for the United States that would mean. So this entire shift off of oil, of which NOPEC would be one modest but important component, is part of a big set of issues having to do with America's place in the world for our children and our grandchildren. And we have to realize that and get on it.
So I'm afraid of the China piece. Just one more piece of a shameless plug, if you don't mind. I actually write about this stuff all the time, postoiltechnology.com, and at Facebook, Post Oil Technology. And I'm very active on Facebook on this subject, talking about just what you said, China. I talk about China all the time, and things like that, and how that's going to affect America in the future.
Yeah. So I just say we're doing a study right now with SAFE about the supply chain, not just about the minerals and the rare earth metals themselves, but also the supply chain and where the United States needs to be, so that in 10 years, even if you don't totally buy into this transformation, if you're wrong, in 10 years you turn around and you can't get any of the resources, we have a whole other problem on our hands. So we're going to be looking at that so we don't create another national security threat. With that, I will just give one plug for electric vehicles, and then we'll turn it over to the crowd. In that, well, I'll say two things. One is, when the oil hit $147, the two things that don't happen is, the housing market has a big problem, your biggest purchase. But then the car market, right? You buy cars, and the modern Western economy is dependent on car sales. And what happened? Our companies went bankrupt, and our government had to bail them out. There's a lot of other reasons that happened, but at the same time, if oil hadn't gone up, and if we weren't caught with China and India growing so rapidly and not keeping up with that demand, our government had to spend money there. Forget just the troops, overseas. On the electric vehicle, I'm on my 4th electric vehicle, but two things in this new vehicle are very important to point out. Number one is, and sadly, my daughter, 6 weeks after getting her license, was rear-ended, and the car was totaled. She's okay, but the good news is it didn't explode. So I would say that this idea that your battery pack is going to explode. Let's remember we put basically gasoline, which is very flammable, in our car. And the other thing I'd say is this vehicle, the one before my first one maybe got 90 miles. The next one got 140 miles, and now we're up to over 250 miles, and that's a sub $30,000 car, not even a Tesla. So it's really an amazing thing watching this technology grow, and we went from $1,000 per battery per kilowatt hour to now it gets like 200. So the innovation is there, and it's really to me a question of what we want to do, not really. And not that we can't do it. Okay, so let's ask questions to the audience.
Yeah, so this may be more of an economics question than a policy question, but where does natural gas fit into this discussion? Because as an outsider looking in, I've been in the energy industry, but as a big believer in markets, it's unclear to me why we haven't seen bigger utilization of natural gas since, to my understanding, America's pretty flush with this stuff.
Well, first, everything is an economics question. Natural gas is a great fuel, and it actually is starting to make inroads into long-distance trucking. We have a lot of the infrastructure already in place. Building heavy-duty trucks that use natural gas is easy. You don't have to build quite as much refueling infrastructure to take advantage of that. And so I think it's going to play an important part in a future energy mix that is more diverse, and so gives us more security because it allows us to not be dependent on just one thing. Why it hasn't, we spent a lot of time regulating the natural gas market almost to death through the 70s and really into the late 70s, and it's taken quite a while to get the market unclogged, and now we have a really vibrant natural gas market. So I think we'll start to see a lot bigger role for natural gas. Another
I think natural gas most of Indianapolis is run on natural gas now, not coal, so that's great. I think a lot of cities are moving that direction. But the transportation thing is interesting because you're right, the trucking industry loves it. Indiana actually is, I think it's the only state in the union that has 3 Japanese companies. We have Subaru, Toyota, and Honda. Our Honda plant in Greensburg, Indiana, actually built natural gas cars, Civics. Just didn't take it.
Yeah.
So they don't make them anymore.
So,
Fueling stations like there.
Yeah, that's right.
right, so I was going to speak to that. So first of all, SAFE is technology neutral in that sense. Look, we believe that as long as we have fuel diversity, that's really important. I do just want to emphasize the point that Admiral Blair said off mic, so natural gas can either be put directly in the cars, or we could burn it as a fuel and electricity at a very high temperature. It's very efficient, and then put it in the cars as well. So I think we are using natural gas as long as we move to electric mobility. But look, we have an infrastructure, we have a market that's not fair and free, that is worth trillions of dollars. As you said before, this chicken and egg problem continues to persist and always has. What comes first, the fueling stations or the vehicles? And, because we don't believe in collusion, there's not really collusion between even those companies to sort of figure that out. So I think that's really why, and when some of these car companies have made this investment, now let's just stay in electric vehicles or even in natural gas vehicles, and the price falls into 2014, as I said before, I rattled off the jobs lost in the oil patch. But let's be clear that companies that were committed to some of these changes, both by producing alternatives, no one wants them now because Americans or others have very short memories of when the prices are high and when they're low. So, as an institution, I would say that look, we want the fair, freest market decision. But one of the reasons we do like to talk about this is because to say that the free market is going to solve this problem is not really true because there's no free market. And I think that NOPEC and as well as just educating people on why this is a collusive market, and we might have a country that invests in all this, but if you're not the Chinese government enforcing it, that investment's going to go away. And so we need to sort of maintain government policy until we can create the transparency, I think, in the market.
So one more thing, when you ask someone who advocates a market solution to something, well, what about this? What about that, right? That part of we don't know, but that's partly because markets are discovery mechanisms. We will discover how to solve problems. So in using natural gas for transportation, so one is to burn it and make electricity. The other is fleet vehicles are relatively easy to switch to natural gas because you don't need a lot of refueling infrastructure. And we've already seen that in terms of buses in cities and local delivery fleets. So we've started to see that happen. And if we do have a free market and we do have energy choice, we're going to find that the market will provide solutions and technology are going to spread. And once you spread and you start having truck stops for long distance trucking, have natural gas available and so forth, then it's easy to spread out from that. We have a lot of infrastructure for using more natural gas. Already, we pipe it all around the country. It's just a matter of extending that last mile to service stations or whatever, and that needs demand. But again, it's really hard to predict the market solution in advance. If I knew that, I'd invest in that.